All right, everyone. So, in this particular lecture, we're going to talk primarily about the war in the Pacific Theater, right? And particularly how the United States came to win that war, how the Allied powers, I should say, came to win that war. So, this is just a recap of homework assignment number 3 that you completed on Monday night. A lot of this is review, I hope. And it just kind of shows an outline of how the Allied powers actually came to victory over the Germans in Europe on May 7th, 1945. So, starting with the invasion of the beaches of Normandy in France on June 6th, 1944. Allied forces then push across France, liberating it from German control. This kind of culminates in what is known as the Battle of the Bulge. Again, you read about that. And from there, you see the Soviet Union, now a firm ally of Britain and the United States, pushing into and reclaiming parts of Eastern Europe and then eventually Germany from the east. The United States and Britain kind of allied forces pushing from France in the west and taking over strategic German cities. By April of 1945, it's pretty clear that the Germans have no other choice but to surrender. We see Hitler at this point take his own life and the life of his dog and his lover, Eva Braun. And then the unconditional German surrender to the Allies comes on May 7th, 1945. So, as this war comes to an end in the European theater, we see the United States specifically shift manpower and resources over to the Pacific campaign, which is still far from won at that point. And when we talk about the Pacific campaign, right, we're talking about the war against the Japanese. And the Pacific Campaign was originally opened in 1942, and with the appointment of General Chester Nimitz and General Douglas MacArthur, who I'll talk about in a little bit, leading the forces and devising US strategies there. So on the screen here, you have kind of two key US strategies when they're fighting the Japanese, and these two strategies are closely linked. So when we think about island hopping, or maybe leapfrogging, right? We're thinking about capturing key Japanese held islands in the Southeast Pacific and in the Pacific Ocean, for kind of retaking those islands and setting up United States and Allied military bases there. A lot of times, a top priority was to take over the airfields that Japan had built in these areas. The United States would not attempt to take over every island that was occupied by Japanese forces. It would bypass some of the most heavily defended strongholds and opt for those islands, especially at the beginning of this campaign in 43 and 44, opt for islands that were less heavily defended with a higher probability of victory. The purpose here is to get the United States close enough to mainland Japan to administer the kind of second component of the Pacific Campaign strategy, which is aerial bombing campaigns. So, bombing key military targets on Japanese main islands, and then eventually bombing civilian targets as well there. So, in order to do that effectively, the United States needs to be able to set up Air Force bases and military strongholds that are close enough to the mainland islands that they can bomb and then return safely to their base. So, this is how the United States devises a plan against Japan after 1943. So here's a couple of maps that I'll show you that kind of just show how the United States and the Allied powers advance through the Pacific. So you can see all arrows kind of pointing towards, at this stage in the game, Indochina, and specifically battles taking place in and around the Philippines, which Japan grabbed around the same time that Pearl Harbor was executed. And you can see mainland Japan in the top here, where American forces are hoping to eventually be able to bomb. This is another map that just kind of shows the same thing. You see these arrows certainly not targeting every single Japanese held island, but targeting those that would be most beneficial to executing the second part of the United States' plan. Okay. I'm not going to say a ton about the battles in the Pacific. There are three particularly that I think are worth mentioning. And while all war battles in World War II were devastating, the Pacific Campaign in the Pacific Theater is known as some of the most bloody and most costly battles of World War II for the United States. It's worth mentioning one of these earlier battles in October of 1944. I mentioned General MacArthur earlier, Douglas MacArthur, who was one of two military generals who commanded U.S. forces in the Pacific. MacArthur had a really decorated career both before and after World War II, up until his controversial removal from command during the Korean War. But he was one of the brains behind the island hopping strategy, and he led a huge kind of number of forces eventually to the mainland of Japan, where he became kind of the acting general of U.S. forces in Japan in 1945. So he was so popular as a war hero that he even considered running for a Republican candidate for president. So this guy is a big deal. And the Battle of Leyte Gulf was when MacArthur successfully led forces to capture Japanese-held islands near the Philippines. Again, if you remember, the Philippines used to be a territory of the United States until Pearl Harbor. And so the idea here is that we're going to push into the Philippines, into the kind of southernmost border of Japan's empire, and begin to weaken the Japanese by taking these strategic and resource-rich places. This goes down in history as one of the largest naval battles in history, definitely the largest naval battle of World War II, and is kind of characterized as the beginning of the use of the Japanese kamikaze. So the pilots that flew their planes and committed suicide in the process into American planes and aircraft carriers and boats. So we can start to see by October of 1944 that the Japanese war effort is becoming desperate. So desperate that they're willing to risk their own pilots' lives just to weaken the United States' war effort. The United States, I'm going to go back for a second. The United States successfully, as it mentions there, captures Leyte Gulf and other islands in the Philippines and manages to destroy 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, which puts a huge dent in the Japanese fleet. This is a turning point for the United States and considered a really important victory, allowing them to reclaim the Philippines and really kind of damaging the Japanese's ability to continue to fight. So we're starting to see the United States decisively take control of the Pacific Campaign by October of 1944. The other battle that I wanted to mention comes a little bit later in February and March of 1945 at Iwo Jima. This is a pretty famous battle of World War II. It's a 5-week attempt to capture all 3 major Japanese airfields on the island of Iwo Jima. Iwo Jima is about 750 miles from Tokyo, so we're getting close to mainland Japan at this point. And while the United States suffered huge numbers of casualties, over 25,000 Marine casualties here, and up to 6,000 dead, the Japanese suffered up to 3 times that amount of casualties, including civilians that lived on the island of Iwo Jima, as well as Japanese soldiers. So we see here that as the war drags on in the Pacific, each battle becomes more and more brutal, resulting in more and more casualties. The Battle of Iwo Jima is where this kind of iconic photograph comes from. This photograph is called The Raising of the Flag on Iwo Jima by Joe Rosenthal. And what you see here are 6 Marines that are essentially planting an American flag atop Mount Suribachi on Iwo Jima, claiming victory over the island. And this particular image is probably one of the most symbolic of the war. It's the most reproduced photograph in the 1950s, and actually won the Pulitzer Prize as well. So it becomes kind of synonymous with American victory in the war and American patriotism as well. And then the last battle that I'll mention is the kind of battle that allows the United States to really carry out some of its major campaigns in Japan. And that's the Battle of Okinawa Island. This is the last stop for the United States troops before they're able to kind of severely damage mainland Japan. The island of Okinawa rests about 370 miles south of Japan, and over 180,000 US troops are kind of part of the onslaught of this island in order, again, to secure air bases for the use of the United States and the Allied powers. To give you some context, right, in April 1945, the war in Europe is coming to an end, so the United States is increasingly focusing its efforts on defeating Japan. If it's possible, Okinawa was an even more deadly and costly battle than Iwo Jima or Leyte Gulf. The United States lost 36 battleships from kamikaze raids and suffered over 50,000 casualties, including over 12,000 men killed in action. But again, Japan's losses were much, much higher, over 100,000 Japanese dead. And the result of this is that it put the United States within striking distance of mainland Japan. Another significant detail of this battle is what happened in the American home front. FDR, who had been president since 1932, had just started his fourth consecutive term as president. Beloved by his country, especially as the war is coming to an end and it looks like an American and Allied victory, he passes away during this battle and was replaced by his very lesser-known Vice President, Harry Truman. So I just wanted to show you some of the coverage of President Roosevelt's death. And Roosevelt does not live to see either victory in Japan or victory in Europe. He passes away before the war comes to an end in either place. And an image, although it's blurry, I apologize, of his funeral procession. You can see his casket behind the horses there, draped in the American flag, and the thousands and thousands of American citizens who came to the streets to pay their respects as his body went by. And so our new president of the United States, Harry S. Truman, we'll talk more about him when we talk about the Cold War. But what's interesting is that by the time of 1945, nobody really cared who FDR's running mate was. FDR was running the show. He was the personality. And it's interesting that it's Harry Truman who is going to have to make one of the biggest and most impactful decisions of any US president in the history of, our nation. He's going to be the one to decide to drop the atomic bombs on Japan. Okay, so one more thing should be noted about the Pacific Campaign, and that's, again, the aerial bombing of the United States. The United States begins to bomb Japan as early as 1944, and then that bombing really picks up in 1945. And the United States figured out that they can use incendiary bombs on military facilities to maximize destruction in Japan. And an incendiary bomb was really a new technology for the United States. It was essentially a giant pipe bomb that had been filled with napalm. And when it hit a target, it was incredibly difficult to put out the fire caused by the napalm. So it was much more effective, much harder to put out than a traditional firebomb. And the result was widespread destruction. Again, the US started by targeting military facilities and then focused in March of 1945 on the city of Tokyo. And instead of military facilities, actually targeted civilian areas and non-military targets to try to force the Japanese government into a faster surrender. It should be noted that incendiary bombing campaigns in Japan resulted in more deaths than the atomic bombs that were later dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This was a constant bombardment of the Japanese mainland, and effective in definitely wearing down the enemy and preventing Japan from being able to continue the war. Most of these were done in the middle of the night at really low altitudes. And so you can just imagine the fright of Japanese citizens as American and Allied bombers are kind of flying just overhead, dropping fire from their planes. So when we think about the keys to the United States victory, okay, definitely the island hopping campaign that allowed the United States to establish and control bases for bombers to kind of refuel and regroup. That is key. What's also key is the sanctions that the United States had placed on Japan from the very beginning. Japan was running out of allies and resources by 1945. The United States had both of those things. Allies in places like Britain and the Soviet Union and Australia, and resources. That's something that we had that the Japanese didn't. We also had a phenomenal kind of war effort and mobilization of the home front, again, which Japan did not have. Okay. So, before we end this war here, I want to take note of what's happening diplomatically as the war comes to an end. So, in the year 1945, two separate conferences take place. One in February of 45, well before German or Japanese surrender, and that is known as the Yalta Conference, and a second in Potsdam in July of 1945. So in July of 1945, the war in Europe is over, but this is before Japan surrenders to the United States. And it's interesting to take note of what happens here. In February of 1945, FDR, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin, the leaders of the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, get together in Yalta and talk about how they're going to cooperate post-war. They talk about what do they want the world to look like after World War II. And during this conference, there is an air of optimism that these three powers can work together effectively. They talk about things like establishing a stronger League of Nations in which the international kind of policing will fall squarely on more nations' shoulders. And so the United Nations is kind of established, laid out at the Yalta Conference. We have promises from the Soviet Union that the areas in Eastern Europe that they liberated from Nazi control would be allowed to have free elections versus Soviet-controlled territories after the war. And the Allies decided that Germany would be divided into 4 zones for now, temporarily. And each Allied power, including France here, would be able to control one of these zones for a period of time. And so overall, the feeling at the Yalta Conference is a pretty good feeling. It looks as if these countries, these leaders are going to work together to build a better post-war world. But if we fast forward to the Potsdam Conference, we have a little bit of a mix-up here in the players. FDR is replaced by Harry Truman, who is far less diplomatically successful. He's not as likable as FDR was, nor did he have the patience that FDR had. Winston Churchill was replaced by Clement Attlee, new Prime Minister of Britain, and we have the returning Joseph Stalin from the Soviet Union. And the tone of this meeting just does not match that of the Yalta Conference. As the war is coming to an end in Japan and has been over in Europe for several months, we see these tensions come to the surface because specifically the United States and Great Britain have a very different idea of what the post-war world should look like. What is established here is that the Soviet Union will invade Japan through Manchuria. The United States had already opened up a front in Japan. Incendiary bombing was taking place, and we were really weeks away from using atomic bombs. The Soviet Union planned to invade Japan through Manchuria. The Soviets did not follow through on their promise of free elections in places like Poland, and continued to control those nations with the Soviet communist government. And no move has been made on what to do with Germany at this point. We're going to talk a little bit more about this, but what I want you to be able to see here is that as the war is coming to an end, the Allied powers are starting to fall apart here in essentially what they believe the world should look like after the war. This is going to be important in setting up the Cold War. All right, last slide here. So how does the United States ultimately win the war? How do we get that surrender from Japan? Through the atomic bombs. We talked about the Manhattan Project in class today. The Manhattan Project produced 3 bombs as of 1945. And it was decided that the United States would target Japanese military and production centers for these bombs. There was a primary and a secondary target given for each mission, and it was established by a group of American politicians, right, and strategists that these targets should have a high military and strategic value. They should be untouched by any previous bombing so that the enemy can see the destruction of the atomic bomb kind of firsthand. The idea is maximum impact here. Okay, maximum impact. One of the 3 atomic bombs was tested first in New Mexico in what is known as the Trinity Test Project. So we had 2 bombs left to use on Japan. Those bombs were dropped on the locations of Hiroshima on August 6th, 1945, and then Nagasaki on August 9th, 1945. Hiroshima was the primary target. It was considered to have a high military value. Everything went well in the dropping of the bombs. And the dropping of Hiroshima, everything went as it should have. On August 9th, however, a variety of different factors resulted in the primary target being bypassed for a secondary target. Nagasaki was a port city in the south, and the primary kind of death toll here is civilian casualties. Okay, the Soviet Union subsequently declares war on Japan and plans for its invasion, but before that really happens, the Japanese are forced to unconditionally surrender to the Allied powers on August 15th, 1945. So one thing I want to take note of, and this is what we're going to kind of talk about in class over the next day or so, is the fact that this decision was not one that was agreed upon by everybody in leadership positions. The decision to use this type of weapon against an enemy is really going to open up a can of worms in the future of warfare. And while Harry Truman ultimately decides, for a variety of different reasons, to drop the bombs, not everybody who participated in the Manhattan Project agreed with this decision. Okay? When all is said and done, after VJ Day, over 60 million people died as a result of World War II. 60 million people. The world's most deadly and destructive war. And I'm gonna just finish with a couple of pictures here. Okay, the first, the picture at the top of what is known as Fat Man was the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. And Little Boy what the atomic bomb dropped on Nagasaki looked like. And the kind of iconic mushroom cloud produced by a nuclear weapon rising up from mainland Japan, and the aftermath, which of course we know lasted much longer than just the few months it took to clean up the mess. The radioactive kind of materials of the bomb still impact these areas where the bomb was dropped. Okay. All right, guys. So we'll debrief some of this tomorrow in class or Friday in class when I see you. And have a good night.